Hello, and welcome to the Storied Arcs podcast. I'm your co-host, Mike.
And I'm your co-host, Alex.
And today we are starting a new season where we will be looking at the book Time Before Time, recently finished from Image Comics. And today, as is our custom, we will be not discussing any of the story. We'll be preparing you for a discussion next week of Volumes 1 and 2. But this week we will look at the creative team. The creators are Rory McConville, Joe Palmer, and Declan Shalvey. And then we've also got a colorist and a letterer who are not listed as creators, but they are pretty consistent throughout the series.
The artist,
the letterers for sure.
The colorist. The colorist is Chris O'Halloran. He is on every issue. They rotate artists, some for story reasons, some I think maybe just to give Joe Palmer a break. But Chris O'Halloran is the colorist for the entire series. And Hassan Otsmane-Elhaou is the letterer. We'll talk about both of them here kind of shortly. But yeah, Time Before Time. This is a very, very recent book. It's 29 issues, ran from May 2021 to November 2023. I think we mentioned next we'll be covering trades 1 and 2. So it has been collected in six trades. I mentioned it's 29 issues, but they did an interesting kind of a publication strategy with this series, in that each of the arcs are 5-issue arcs. So volume 1 is issues 1 through 5, but volume 2 is issues 7 through 11. Because what they did was every 6th issue, they brought in a guest artist and they told a standalone story from somewhere else in their universe. So they have their main narrative going on, but every 6th issue they took a break and they just told a kind of an adjacent character to one of our main characters, someone just on the periphery of the story. And initially, I don't know if this was the plan or not, but initially those issues weren't collected. And, those issues going along, 6, 12, 18, and 24. Initially they weren't collected because I want to say when issue 29, the final issue, came out in November 2023, it was a few months later that volume 5 came out. The trade came out maybe February or March, as is typical. But I don't think volume 6, which collected those 4 one-shots, I don't think that came out until only a month or so ago, as we're recording now, Mike. So it would have been 7 months after volume 5 came out. So 6 or 7 months after the narrative finished up in terms of trades, that they came out and released these 4 one-shots. So I don't know if it was their plan to ever collect them, which is not an uncommon thing. It's a way for they want readers to go out and buy and get the single issues, to not have some issues collected in trade is that it happens every once in a while. So
you have to wait for the deluxe or complete edition or something like
exactly, that. Yeah. And at 29 issues, this is the kind of series that you could easily see them being
it'll be a compendium
at some point. Yeah. Whatever the reason was, if you were reading this in trade only, you would have gotten those volumes 1 through 5, and you would have gotten the entire story, but you wouldn't have gotten the entire world that they're telling. So volume 6 being those 4 one-shots. And so I think, Mike, yours and our plan is we're going to discuss this using the trade numbering, going volumes 1 and 2 for our first discussion, then 3 and 4 for our second discussion, and then 5 and 6 for our final discussion, meaning that 5 again is the end of the narrative story, and then we'll look at those 4 one-shots together that are in volume 6. So we're going to treat this the way that they have decided to number these trades, so the way that it would look on a shelf. But I can't imagine that would be the way they would do it if and when this is collected in a deluxe or a compendium or an omnibus, something like that. I would imagine in that case they would do it straight numerically, because there's no reason to pull these stories out other than to
I think
keep
the
trays
reason
nice and clean.
Right. I like, imagine you're someone who doesn't go to comic shops. You just read from the library and you just read in final trade form. And I think that's kind of the publication mentality here with volume 6 being all of the interstitials
Yes.
is it's not going to disrupt the flow and make you feel like you're missing something like, wait, who are these characters? Were they what's happening?
Yeah.
And
But in a compendium, in a single publication format,
you can stick them in.
it doesn't
Yeah.
matter. There's no reason to put them at the end.
I think these
When
are very much like the rabbit in the Unwritten, which they were doing at the end of every other trade. They were doing
yeah,
an
yeah.
issue that was seemingly unrelated, but eventually you realize like, oh, this is intimately woven into the universe here.
Well, I think that's a good comp on the surface there. I think you'll find that these four interstitials they're far more related because they're in the same universe and they're talking around the characters that we already know.
Well,
like
eventually the backstory of the rabbit is the main story in the main issues.
100%. But at the time, you don't know that. You're
Right.
just getting this kind of weird
Extremely
other story.
vulgar, yeah.
Yeah, but so here with Time Before Time, I think there's a discussion to be had when we get there at the end of our talk here about that publication strategy in terms of putting these interstitials in, and then in terms of single issue release, and then pulling them out of the story continuity. Not continuity because they're in continuity. Pulling them out of the reading order, I guess, by putting them in
the
volume
sequence.
6.
Yeah.
Reading
the
sequence,
sequential. Yeah.
yeah. So we'll get there when we talk about that there in that discussion. But so if you are reading this in single issue, something you have, whether you have them physically or you have them digitally, whatever it is, you can skip for now every sixth issue, and when we next week when we start talking about the series and we're talking about volumes, trade volumes 1 and 2, that's issues 1 through 5 and issues 7 through 11. So if you happen to be reading along that way, you want to go and skip those interstitials. And I think as we mentioned, we'll talk about real quick. We'll get to the full creative team, but next week when we talk about volumes 1 and 2, those are the first 2 volumes that Joe Palmer, the artist, the artist did. Artist and co-creator. From there, they kind of move through artists. They don't cycle through artists. They kind of bring in different artists for kind of short mini-ish arcs. And I think we'll talk about those artists as we get to those arcs. So starting really with issue 13, 13 and 14 is a little 2-issue arc drawn by Ron Salas. 15 through 17, Eric Zawadzki. 19 to 23, Jorge Coelho. 25 through 28 is Joffo, and then Joe Palmer comes back for 29, the last issue. The one shots are drawn. Declan Shalvey draws one himself. He draws the first one, which is issue 6. PJ Holden draws issue 12. Lauren Knight 18, and Will Morris, our friend from Gospel, draws 24. So we'll talk about all those as we get to them, either in the trades or into volume 6 when we get to those 6 one shots.
Yeah, and there's just a little callback to earlier in our podcast, way earlier, I guess. There is an interview with Will Morris that I did after we covered the book Gospel, which was his creator-owned, he did everything on it, everything but the covers type book, and he did one of these interstitials, and I think I just brought it up in terms of not about the story, but just, what was it like stepping into someone else's art? And, this is a guy who had just written, drawn, inked, colored, published his own book. And he was like, oh, it was basically a total breath of fresh air to step in, mimic someone else's style. The story's already done. Like all the character design's done. I don't need to think about anything. I just need to do it. And I was like, oh, that actually does sound pretty great as an artist. Whereas I thought it'd be stressful to try to look like someone else. But artists don't seem to be too bothered by that. They're not trying to be cover bands, when they step in like that. And I'm just thinking back to Revival, when we had spot pages that were filled in by someone else. It wasn't like you could still tell it was that artist. It wasn't them trying to camouflage themselves.
And I think that's the thing is when guest artists come in, they're not expected to be, yeah, cover artist they're not expected to mimic anyone's style. You're being brought in to bring your flavor, your style to this. You know, you're being they want your talent. They want your ability. They don't want you to come in and do Joe Palmer. They don't want you to come in and do the same thing over and over again. And I think the connecting factor ends up being the colorist, in this case, Chris O'Halloran. So the palette looks the same, so the background look the same, but the way that you draw a character, the way that you draw, your whole style is what you're meant to bring into it. So I don't think I don't think there is really a worry about, and especially I think a series, as we'll see, that brings in so many artists and then eventually goes back to the co-creator. You're doing that for a reason. You want to bring a different vibe and a different feel to the issues into the story, but you're not worried about it being too jarring or disruptive, because everything else about the story stays the same. Well, all you're changing is the line work, because those larger ideas, you can put your spin on a character as long as the character has these consistent base elements, because the design's already done. Just because you draw faces or bodies a little differently, everything else about the character, all the defining characteristics are going to be the same. So it's not going to be disruptive for the reader.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, where would you like to start? Should we start with the image synopsis, or do you want to end with that?
Let's end with that. Let's start. Let's run through our creative team here. As you mentioned, we have 3 credited co-creators. There are 2 credited co-writers, Declan Shalvey and Rory McConville. Declan Shalvey is easily the most notable name here, and that's
I feel bad about this,
McConville or Palmer, but they just haven't done a lot of work in America. That's what it comes down to.
Right. And I have referred to this for years as Declan's book, which is
and that's
incorrect.
That's,
I mean, it's he can claim it, but it's he shares credit.
And he wouldn't claim it. That's the thing, is that no creator would ever say this is my book without talking about the people that they worked with on. But what it comes down to is Declan has done so much more work in America than McConville and Palmer have. A lot of Declan's work, if I would say if you know his work, you know it mainly from Marvel, but that isn't the case. He's also done a ton of image work, but Marvel, I think, is where I first saw most of his stuff. Oftentimes working as an artist, sometimes just doing covers, sometimes some of the books he kind of first worked on, a book like Moon Knight with Warren Ellis, or Venom with Rick Remender and then Cullen Bunn. He came in and did like the first arc or couple arcs, and then moved off it as an artist, but kept doing the covers. So he'll have a run of covers that he did for Moon Knight, but maybe it's like 18 issues of Moon Knight, but he only did the first 6 in terms of interior art. He's done that a lot. He did a Thunderbolt series with Jeff Parker. There was a Punisher series with that was done by Becky Cloonan and Steve Dillon that he only did covers on, but again, seeing his art out there on the cover, kind of helps
makes
with
him loom larger.
The visibility there. He's done Declan is a writer artist. He does cartoon his own work. A lot of that happens is his creator and stuff, like an image and all that. But he has done a few things like that for Marvel. The first one he did was a little kind of a Nick Fury story during Civil War II. There's a series called Civil War II Choosing Sides, where it was just kind of an anthology series where there were like 4 or 5 small stories throughout. And so like a 4 or 5 issue series, and you got like a short story each one of those. He wrote and drew a Nick Fury story during that time, and he's currently doing a Mystique story, a little mini series. I want to say it's a mini series. It's going to be like 4 or 5 issues. It eventually will be, for this current From the Ashes X-Men era that we're in right now. So he's writing and drawing that Mystique book. For hire stuff, I would say it's mostly Marvel, and it is. He's got very, very little DC work, a lot of covers. He's done some shorts,
covers. And that's where he's got a bigger footprint in DC.
Yeah. He does covers, variants. He does some shorts and some backups. He did a backup story during I think still the most recent iteration of All-Star Batman. written by Scott Snyder. He did a backup story in the first couple issues with that, and did some covers and whatnot. So DC, he has not done a lot of interior work, just some shorts and backups, like I said. He does do a lot of I guess IP work for other companies. Like he did a 28 Days Later book. He's an artist on at Boom. He has two ongoing books right now at Dynamite where he's writing both of them, not drawing, but Thundercats and the Terminator. So Dynamite's got a lot of licensed properties, and so in terms of outside of this Mystique book over at Marvel that he's writing and drawing that I mentioned, he's also writing Thundercats and the Terminator over at Dynamite. So a lot of stuff going on. Whether it's him as a writer, him as an artist, things of that nature. But as I mentioned, if you don't know him from Image, if you don't know him from Marvel, you probably know stuff from Image. He has a couple of original graphic novels that are set like in the Irish underworld, Irish mobsters. Declan being a very proud Irishman. Savage Town with Philip Bear, or Bog Bodies with Gavin Fullerton. Those are both original graphic novels. Books that he set out that have this, that are set in that kind of world. He has another book that he wrote and drew called Old Dog. I want to say either that's ongoing or just wrapped, or it had an ongoing series and then it's had some like subsequent series like Old Dog :
Old
something.
Dog Operations, I think.
Yeah. I think
that's ongoing, but Old Dog original series is finished. But
I think the property is ongoing. The title is ongoing, and I think it's a matter of like maybe when he has time, he comes back to it, because again, that's a book he writes and draws himself. So maybe it's he's got ideas for it. Yeah, it's Old Dog : Operations : something else. He'll just keep returning to that property that's his. He did a really cool book. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think this is my unusual take on Declan, which when we met him last year at a comic expo, I was telling him this. I don't think he hears it very often, but I really love this little backup story that he did in All-Star Batman. During the Rebirth era, the Cursed Wheel, which was the training program for the Signal, which I think got him the title Batman and the Signal, which was like a 3-issue miniseries that was like, it was fine, but like it didn't do anything for me. But I actually thought the backup story was overshadowing the main story in All-Star Batman, and it was one of those where I would read those issues and then read the thing in the back and be like, oh, I kind of wish these were switched places. I wish this Two-Face story was the backup and this training program with the Signal was the main story. But that being said, I haven't read that since it was out in single issue. Mm-hmm. It just made an impression on me at the time because the Signal was a very new character to me in 2016.
Yeah, Duke's he's still a relatively new character in the grand scheme of things over as part of the Bat family. But yeah, he said that's like his only main DC work. It is not something that he has done a lot of work for, and I don't think he's ever been Marvel exclusive. I just think that's just where most of his work has ended up. So, but anyway, what I was saying is there was one of my favorite books I think he's ever done that I wish Olive's ever coming back to. Probably not at this point. It's Injection. It's an Image book with Warren Ellis. Declan is the artist on that. And it was just this. It was a cool book about basically, it was like a small group of geniuses that went and ruined the world, who had to come back together and try to fix it. It was a really neat book. It ran for 3 trades worth, so maybe like 15, 16, something like that. And then there had been some gaps in the book, and then I think it went on a hiatus, and then never came back, and probably never will at this point, which is too bad. Said it was a cool book. Another book I want to mention that I really enjoyed, that he is credited as the story creation on, which is called Rogues' Gallery. Excuse me. It was he's credited with the story with Hannah Rose May, who I believe is an actress and has gotten more into writing comics now, along with artist Justin Mason. It's a really kind of a cool book. It's kind of it's a take on kind of the deranged fan. A little bit in the misery oeuvre, I guess. But again, he's credited as story creation on that, and I think the actual scripts and specifics then written by Hannah Rose May. But that's a really cool book over at Image as well. The final book I'll mention is he did covers for an OGN called Write It in Blood. And that's notable because that came out right before Time Before Time. And Write It in Blood was an OGN that was written by Rory McConville and drawn by Joe Palmer. And the colors were done by Chris O'Halloran and letters were done by Hassan Otsmane-Elhaou. So the entire team for Time Before Time worked on this book, Write It in Blood. Came out right before Time Before Time was published. And Write It in Blood is a cool book. It was published as an OGN here with Image. It's divided in like 30 pages long chapters. So it's possible that it might have been released in single, and the chapters read that way, like they read like single issues almost. And so I wonder if it might have been published somewhere else, maybe in the UK, is in single issue, but here in the States, in Image, it was published as an OGN. It's a crime story. It's about two hitmen who are brothers, set in Texas. It's kind of like a one last job kind of thing where obviously things go awry. But it's a cool book. You get a little bit of the sense of what you see in Time Before Time, in the sense of kind of larger world, larger forces, crime families, crime syndicates, crime organizations, but we're focused on like just a couple random people, some characters set in this larger machine, trying to work their way through and out of and maybe with some of these larger stories. But that's a cool book that I was just checking out. And it's kind of one of the main things I think you'll get in the States from Roy McConville and Joe Palmer. As I mentioned, those two guys, McConville is a co-writer and Palmer as the artist. Most of the work's overdone in the UK. Roy McConville's written Spawn. So for the Spawn heads out there and some of the expanded Spawn universe, there's some stuff you can find from him, from Image here. A lot of his work, Judge Dredd over in the UK, and working and 20,000 AD, which is where publishes Judge Dredd, but stories that are published in that magazine. Same with Joe Palmer. A lot of his work is going to be over there. 2000 AD, not 20,000. Sorry, 2000 AD. Most stuff being in the UK, so just not a whole lot over in the States. The colorist, I mentioned Chris O'Halloran. He mentioned how he is the colorist on every issue of Time Before Time. So even though they rotate through artists, doesn't matter who it is, we're bringing the same colors, and I think that's where the continuity comes in. As I mentioned, having the same color palette,
and it's such a distinct vibe.
There is, and I think that's what really ties things together in terms of when you're working from artist to artist to artist. I think sometimes maybe you want to jump and have a real kind of harsh, distinctive change in your art style from a storytelling reason,
Right.
But I think because spoiler alert, Time Before Time is a time travel story, so they're jumping between all these different eras. There's already a sharp contrast when you're jumping from different eras. So I think that falls on the plate of Chris O'Halloran, the colorist, regardless of who the artist is. So because you already have those really harsh changes in vibe and feel and look, you want to keep that thing consistent, even if the line art changes. So seeing him on every issue was great. Most of the stuff he has is Image work. It's creator-owned work. A lot of some of the bigger names you may be aware of: Ice Cream Man, Haha, The Closet, Falling in Love on the Path to Hell, A Righteous Thirst for Vengeance. So among some of the series I just named there, kind of the two artists that I think O'Halloran works with almost every single time they work is Martin Morazzo and Andre Lima Araujo. Maybe it's Arroyo. Not sure how to pronounce that. But those two guys, whenever they work, O'Halloran is coloring them. He's done some spot work at Marvel, and really only one major work at DC. This book called The Boy Wonder that was written and drawn by Junie Ba. Really, really cool Robin story that just came out recently, just finished up recently. So not a lot of for hire work. I've read all the, and I think you've read most of them. The James Bond books
Hmm.
over at Dynamite. O'Halloran does a lot of
I've
the
fallen
colors for
behind
those.
on it, but yeah.
He's done a
Uh,
lot of the colors on for that. And one book that I of note that I read over at Boom called Folklords by Matt Kinn and Matthew Smith. He's just done, he's someone that just does he does a lot of coloring work, said mostly at Image, mostly at for creator owned stuff. Not a lot of for hire work, but he's someone that is out there, and it's like he has his guys too, that there are artists out there that whenever they work, you know, he is their colorist. And I think, you see those partnerships, and he's someone that his name you're going to see a lot of. Probably worth noting as well too. Everyone here is, they're based in over in the UK and adjacent. Shalvey and McConville are both Irish. Joe Palmer, I think he might be. I think he's English. Oh, Halloran is as well. And then the letterer, Hassan Otsmane-Elhaou, aka we'll call him Haas because that's what he goes by. He's also London based, I believe. He's become a big time letterer in the last couple of years. He had been someone who had been in comics and adjacent to comics, but not working in the industry. He used to run a YouTube channel called Strip Panel Naked, which is really cool. I don't think he's updated in a while, maybe like a video or two in the past couple of years. But if you want like
but I haven't seen it before, so it's all new to me. So,
super granular deep dives into like comic construction, Strip Panel Naked, it is awesome. That's kind of where he got his name and got his start. He then went and founded a comics journalism magazine, a digital magazine called Panel by Panel, which twice won the Eisner for best comic related periodical slash journalism in 2019 and 2023. It folded. I think it folded in 2023, I think. So I think it ran from like 2018 to 2023. It's about 5 years. Just some incredible long form writing about comics, interviews about comics, talking to creators and things like that. It's very cool book. Magazine that I think you can still get like back issues of if you go on to like Gumroad or whatnot. But that's panel by panel, panel X panel, if you want to look that up. But as I mentioned, he has in the last handful of years has become in the industry now as a letterer, big time letterer. Just earlier this year, 2024, he won another Eisner, this time specifically to him. He won the Eisner for best letterer. So he is out there now,
okay.
pretty much works for every company and has worked for every company with the exception of Marvel, because Marvel has their own in-house studio, virtual calligraphy. So if you're not working for VC, you're not working for Marvel, but pretty much everywhere else, you'll see him on DC, Image, Boom, probably Dynamite, probably some IDW stuff. He's all over the map. He's everywhere, but he's a name that you're seeing a lot more of, and he does a lot of work here. In terms of lettering that I think we'll talk about. So yeah, that's our team here for this book. It's just, when you see the name again, and this is no shots at Roy McConville and Joe Palmer, who I think their work. I said I've read Write It in Blood. I think it's very cool. It's a very cool crime story. When this book comes out, it's sold on the name of Declan Shalvey because he's the name that people know. And
Sure.
so if that's the way to get people in, at least initially, it was the way I came in too. That he's co-writing a book. This is he's the name that I recognize. He's the reason I started reading it. It was at a time when I was reading this so much stuff, I fell off, and I've come back to because we're
Is
doing it for the show now.
it's
But
wild that we have the exact same origin story with this book. I
yeah.
came because of Declan. I was reading single issue, fell off, but have just been grabbing the trades every time they come out, waiting for them to say, "Okay, it's over now."
Yeah.
And only then did I realize, like, oh my god, the trades were skipping issues. And only when I saw which issues were contained in volume 6 was I like, oh, they've been doing a whole thing, which was, clearly a long-term plan or either a really convenient retrofit afterwards that the series would end and there would be enough single issues standalone left to compile its own trade. That's
Well,
about the same size as the other trades.
I mean, it's 4 issues for volume 6, and all the trades are 5 issues long. I mean, it was clearly their plan to have these interstitial stories. Saying whether or not the plan was to ever compile them into their own trade, I think that was something they probably decided on later. I could I could have easily seen them being like, yeah, well, we wrote those stories, they're out there, but they're not part of the trade collections. That was a single issue thing only. I could totally have seen that being the initial thought process, but eventually, them putting it in their own trade in volume 6. And as we said, when this eventually gets a hardcover deluxe edition or a nice softcover compendium, all the issues will be there and they'll probably all be in order. But at least initially, those 6 issues there were kind of lost in the ether. And if you didn't have them, you wouldn't have lost anything from the story. They're only additive to the story.
Sure.
Yeah. At least, so they're additive to the narrative, they're additive to the world. So not having them, if you didn't know they were there, if you just picked up the trades 1 through 5 and never read like the little part that tells you which issues are included, if you never paid attention to that,
you would have gotten a satisfying character arc for your main character.
You would have gotten the story. That is the narrative. That is the story of Tom Fortnite. You would have gotten that. But so without those 4 other interstitials, those one shots, you're just not getting everything that they did with the story. So no, I think it'll be an interesting conversation when we get there in terms of, what kind of storytelling decision that was. And I anytime you have, I think that you can talk to various creators about this kind of storytelling decision when they do kind of one-offs or different versions of their story, because they're trying something. Maybe it's a one-time thing, or like this where it's scheduled every X number of issues, and then when things get to be collected, they decide either to include them or not include them. I've heard from various creators about, well, at the time it seemed like a cool idea, the single issue only thing. But later, as you go on, you're thinking like, well, like, why did we do that? Why don't we put, why don't we include everything we did? Why are we withholding this? So I think it depends creator to creator, series to series. But I said it'll be an interesting talk when we get there about how the story reads when you read those stories all at the end, right?
Sure.
So
yeah. But it's the creators made the decision.
Exactly. Yes. So we can talk about how that decision plays and how, I guess, we the reader, how that plays for us, versus if you were reading this single issue, 1 through 29 all the way through, what those breaks would have felt like versus what those breaks are like in trade. So because you are right, it regardless of what it is down the line, this is the choice that they made for the initial release, the collected release.
Right. This is how, if you're a trade reader, this is how they intended you to experience the story, and which is why our podcast is going to do it that way.
Absolutely. And they know, every creator knows that their book is going to get far more, it's going to be read by a far larger audience in the collected format, in the trade paper format, than it is in any other format. That
right.
Seeing these 6 volumes, number 1 through 6, more people are going to read it this way than did in the single issue, and will relative to any future release. That this is the way it's going to be read. So you're right. They made the choice to go 1 through 6. So the last thing you read for this story are those 6 one-shots together. So we'll talk about that when we get there. But I guess we should finally talk about this book in general. I already spoiled that it's about time travel. So I don't know what else is there to go with.
Well, it's not your, it's not Paper Girls.
No.
There's time travel is its own genre now. There's so much of it. And I this is not a spoiler to say, this is not a book that is interested in the mechanics of time travel. It's not that type of sci-fi.
Yeah.
Because, someone asked a question in, very early on in the first trade about like, oh, well, won't this happen if X, Y, and Z? And it's very much the Hulk from Endgame explanation of like, whatever happened. You can't undo that by doing that because the thing that happened then is what caused you to be you now.
Yeah.
So that doesn't negate that. And
It's presented early on. It's presented as closed loop time travel.
yes, yeah,
Yeah,
there it is.
yeah.
Um,
You're right though. It's Hulk. It is what Hulk is saying there. So,
but they're not interested in really, like, if you're looking for the type of sci-fi that wants to have a philosophical discussion about time travel,
yes,
this is the wrong book.
yeah,
This is merely the setting. This is not. It's not even really about time travel. It's more about gang wars using time travel.
yeah. Time travel is a tool.
It's
It is simply it's a
yeah.
world. You exist in a world that accepts that time travel is a thing that people can do. And we jump all over. We jump forward in time. We jump backwards in time. Do you have the official image synopsis up? Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Why don't you read that real quick?
Well, okay, yeah. So I already have like an asterisk within the first 4 words, but
Well, it doesn't matter. Just
here it is. Okay.
Read it straight. Yeah.
All right. So they say the year is 2140, and to escape a world with no future, many turn to the Syndicate, a criminal organization who, for the right price, will smuggle you back in time to a better life. After working for the Syndicate for years, Tatsuya and Oscar decide to steal one of their boss's time machines, but soon find out that the one thing you can't run from is your past.
Yeah.
Pretty great. I mean, that's pretty great writing for the little pitch.
Yeah, it's a good
there.
blurb. Yeah.
And that's what they're not doing. Eventually Image said this is Saga meets Looper, which I think is pretty apt. As far as those elevator pitch things, they're very limiting in general. And I suspect if I ever wrote a book and they were like, okay, it's the X versus, X meets X pitch, I'm like, that's so reductive. I hate it. But that gets the job done. It puts you in the ballpark.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think the when you talk about time travel stories, or books that or stories that involve that, again, they're not about time travel, but that utilize time travel, you're trying to find the other story that people are going to know that uses similar-ish rules, right?
Yeah. I mean, why wouldn't you? You're stupid not to.
And so we already mentioned Paper Girls in terms of time travel. I agree with you. This is not like that in terms of books that we've talked about. This is a different feel in terms of what time travel is. And I would say Looper's pretty good. So they're not just talking about Looper in terms of like, because that's popular. I think there are elements of Looper, both in terms of what the story is, who the characters are, and kind of how they deal with time travel, that are pretty applicable to Time Before Time.
Right.
Well, and I guess that really only matters if you've seen Looper, but I guess you should stop listening to this real quick and go watch Looper.
Go watch Looper, yeah. Since you didn't have me reading.
And also read Saga if you haven't read Saga. Like, stop listening to this, go read Saga.
Pause our podcast for as long as you need to catch up on Saga.
Yeah. But, and once you've read Saga and watched Looper, and then you start reading Time Before Time, it's kind of hard. I mean, the Saga part, it's not as fantastic. It's not a fantasy story like Saga is.
No.
But it is
the two factions tearing each other's eyes out.
Yeah. So there are instead of warring,
like Paper Girls has that too, but Paper Girls is more the Empire versus the Rebellion rather than two gangs. There's no good gang.
Yeah. So that image synopsis mentions the Syndicate. We should. It's no spoiler to say there are other organizations out there. Like there's the Union. So there's a whole lot of capital T, the something capital, the Union, the Syndicate. They're these warring factions, and they're trying to control the world or whatever it is by controlling time travel. And so, what we're focusing on are people jumping back and forth into the future, into the past. It gets a little messy. And I think there's a worry, I think, that I always have when there's time travel stories, that our creators will get a little too clever.
Right.
And that's always a worry for me when I start reading stories like this, because at least I accept that when you start reading a time travel story, that you're going to be confused at the beginning, that there's going to be a lot of overlapping characters and times because they want to set that up, right? They're intentionally putting the reader off on a wrong foot, throw all these things out there, loop back in time, show characters at different points in their lives, so that when they get to the end, whenever that is, and they tie everything up, they can point back to the beginning and say, look how smart we were, you know?
Yeah. Well, I mean,
And it doesn't always work. It doesn't always work, but I accept that in the beginning, I'm going to get that everything thrown at the wall. So everything's on the table for them to come back to and be like, see, wink, wink, had it planned the whole time, whether or not they actually did.
yeah, which I think it's perfectly valid way to tell a story. And I am so much more accepting of it when the premise of the story is time travel.
Yes, it does give them more leeway.
Well,
for me as a reader.
Yeah, no, for me as a reader, I think the thing that I have grown most weary of is this, like, writers telling, ordinary stories and scrambling the timeline just to make things seem more interesting. I'm like, if your story isn't interesting in chronological order, then I don't think it's going to be interesting because you scrambled the order.
That's fair.
Now, that said, some of my favorite writers scramble the heck out of stories. Tom King is a big timeline scrambler. Jeff Lemire is a big timeline scrambler. Like, everyone's guilty of it, but there are lesser writers who do it and do it very poorly. And I'm like, okay, in a book about time travel, it's almost impossible. Like, the actual scrambled way was if these issues went in the order that the stories appear, that would be bonkers. And then you have to reconstruct the whole thing in terms of the character's journey. That would be a really clever, crazy way, but it would be so incomprehensible that
and also weirdly significantly harder to write, I think.
Harder to write, harder to read. Yeah, I mean, you'd have to have all 30 issues written at once and then say, okay, have a production meeting where you say everything that happens in the 20th century is got to be issues 1 through 3. Everything in the 21st century, that would just be an unwieldy way to write and read a book like this. But there's, like, I guess this dates our episode just a little bit, but very recently, Tom Taylor started his run on Detective Comics, which was fantastic. I absolutely adored what's his first issue, 1090.
Yeah.
But the very first page or two is like Batman interrogating a shadowy figure in a police interrogation room, and it says like 3 weeks from now or something like that. And then it tells this fantastic story. And I'm like, those opening pages added nothing to this for me. Like, I'm not going to finish this story arc and be like, if anything, it just robs me of the suspense of, like, how long this story is going to play out. Like, I know whenever we get to real time, Batman's going to wrap up this case in about 3 weeks, or at least get him, to a police interrogation room. Like, it just doesn't add anything. It was an unnecessary time thing. And then most of the issue is jumping back to Thomas Wayne's life and Bruce's a young child. So it's just one of those where it's like, you've already got the time jump in there. Why do why do that? And it might have been an editor note. It might have been, something they shoved in, or it may have a great payoff that I just can't see from one issue. But to me, that was the type of time thing that irked me, because I was like, it's a Batman book. It's not a time travel book. We don't need 3 different timelines in a 22-page story. In my opinion. So anyway, I am totally down with the type of time slicing that we do in storytelling in a Paper Girls, in a Time Before Time, in something that is blatantly this. I do think it has become a crutch for many, many writers or editors to say, oh, why don't we just slice this up and move it around a little bit?
I think when it's done poorly, it really, really sticks out.
Right. Well, especially when, it's the same as whether it's in the same time or not. If you have a B plot that's just so bad or so uninteresting, that it doesn't matter where it is in time. Yeah. It just feels like you're robbing the reader of the good story.
And if there's one thing I'll say about Time Before Time that I think I hope makes sense, is that because there's so much time jumping, and we're talking like we're jumping like hundreds of years, it actually doesn't super matter when our characters are, regardless of who you're following. Doesn't matter if they're in the future or in the past. Does that make, like the
Right.
setting only really matters in terms of like what the surrounding world around them looks like and maybe what technology is available to them, you know? But like the story is such that you don't have to super keep track of like, oh, now they're 1987. Now they're in 2141. Now they're in 3333.
Totally. Yeah. You
Like
don't need to keep a notebook saying like, okay,
exactly.
this
Yeah,
is what
yeah,
happened
yeah.
in that time.
Exactly. And so I think the story is such that because it's just the time travel is effectively background noise. It's the setting that the world is in. So yeah, you don't have to put up the crazy person board with the string and the post-it notes and all of that. You don't need to follow along that way. The story isn't about all of that. So while it can seem overwhelming at the beginning, like having, there's always a panel of like, here's the year that we're in, again, 1988, 2140, 33, whatever, 34, whatever, we're jumping all over the place. None of that actually specifically matters. Because the characters that are there that you meet there can be at any other time as well.
Right.
So yeah, it isn't like you're meeting someone from 2140 who jumps to 2190, and it's important because you meet those people there. People in 2190 can also jump back to 1987 or jump forward to the 3000 something, whatever. So the not getting bogged down in the specifics, what year are we now, I think is helpful when reading this story.
Yeah.
Like if you free yourself of that early,
just keep going, let it wash over you, and and they'll bring you home because it's a talented creative team here.
I would say the one thing, and I would, if you agree with me here, what's important to note is that first year, 2140. And I think what's important is, are you in, just knowing, are you in the future from that point? Or are you in the past from that point? I think that's it. I think that's you should pay attention to. Just
right.
The relative distance, not the actual distance, the relative distance from that main year, 2140, 2141, something like that. Just knowing if you were in the future or in the past. I think that's what's important. Would you agree with that?
Yes, because that's our main character's native time.
His timeline. Yes. Yeah.
And so everything is relative. Everything is past or future based on who our character is, not who, if he's fighting an organization from the future, we call them an organization from the future because they're the future relative to Tetsuo. Is that how you say his name?
Yeah. Tetsuo. Yeah. Maybe Tatsuo. Maybe,
I wasn't sure. It was one of those where you read it and don't think of it until you're doing a podcast and saying it out loud. But we'll have to make an official decision on it for next week because I suspect we'll say his name a lot.
If I had to guess, I would guess. Well, so I would say it's Tatsuo because most people would say Tetsuo, and having the emphasis on the second syllable isn't how you say a lot of ethnic names, and a character like that, which has a vaguely Japanese sense to it, is going to be the emphasis on the first syllable. So Tatsuo is how I would go.
Yeah.
And then Oscar, I'm pretty sure is just Oscar. So
sure. I feel good about that one. So yeah, now I'm like, okay, but if I were saying Tatsuo with a heavy Irish accent, well, this is how the creative team discussed it.
Yes. But I've haven't spoken to Declan Shalvey, who is very, 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 very lovely, very awesome. I'm not trusting the random Irish accent to be like, that's how you pronounce a Japanese name. So
right.
Yeah, Tatsuo I think is what it is. But you're right. Past and future have no meaning in a time travel story other than our point of reference, and our point of reference is Tatsuo and Oscar's time, which is 2140, or I guess eventually it comes 2141. But it's that time frame.
Right.
So
I think that's the Paper Girls comp of it all. Is that everything was relative to the 1980s?
Yes, because that's where
and their language was all 80s, and I kind of wonder why they wouldn't have used Looper meets Paper Girls or something. But I think Saga gets more of the adult nature of this because this is. But then again, like Paper Girls is not a kid-friendly book, even though it's about kids.
Yeah. Because like Looper meets Paper Girls is time travel meets time travel.
That's true.
So,
Um,
I mean, like,
yeah, I mean, like, yeah, I'm trying to remember the details of Looper
and they're
now.
not gonna and they're not gonna say Paper Girls meets Saga because that's Brian K. Vaughan meets Brian K. Vaughan. So, like,
I didn't even think of that. That would be the most
yeah,
hilarious bit. Yeah, but that's how probably like assuming Brian K. Vaughan was still at the stage where he had to pitch anything.
yeah,
I think he could confidently walk into a meeting and say, "It's a Brian K. Vaughan book meets a Brian K.
Brian K.
Vaughan book,"
Vaughan
and they'd
book,
be
yeah,
like, "Sold." Um,
yeah. So no, I think Looper. If you've seen Looper, I think that gives you a sense of not only the time travel aspect of it, but the kind of characters. Because I mean, like Tatsuo and Oscar, like they're henchmen for a criminal organization. You know,
oh yeah, well that
so
and it's one of those where it's like they become more likable the more you spend time with them.
yeah.
But if you just read the first issue, you're like, I'm not sure I really care about this guy,
and
other
and
than
and,
like
and there's a lot,
he's in a bad spot.
with it, there's a lot. We'll get to it next week in our discussion. But there's it's not a major plot point, but it's hammered a lot of like who are the people that work for the syndicate. You know, like what kind of person would do this? What to do the job that Tatsu and Oscar do? You know, that regardless of what we, the audience, see them in their off time or whatever, talking to you, being friends and hanging out, like what kind of person is in a state to work for a group like the Syndicate? And the answer is like nobody good.
Right.
So even as they are our main characters, we follow them through the story. Their starting point is like these aren't the greatest people in the world. And so yeah, if you've seen Looper and you have a sense of like no one's really a good guy. You have your protagonists and main characters, but like no one's good. So but yeah, no, this is a really fun book. And I think yeah, I think my my kind of advice for you, if you never read this book, never done it before, is treat the sci-fi as soft sci-fi. Just don't
Yeah.
worry about the details.
Which
Just
honestly is my type of sci-fi. I think people have probably picked that up before that like I
I,
get very bored with too much exposition on that. We're like, it's just like calm down and tell me a story.
well, yeah, and I think that's fair. I think for me, if you're going to get granular in your detail, then like you better be on. You know, like if you're going to take the time to explain how the time travel works, there better not be any holes in it. You know, that's the way that I approach it, and it's very difficult to do. It's much easier to do a softer sci-fi than it is to do like a really hard science sci-fi. Like if you're going to go down that route, if you're going to get into the science, then your science better be good. You know,
Right.
uh, I don't want it. I don't want a bunch of BS there with your science. If you're going to go down that route, you better show me you put the work in. But this book isn't that. This book's not concerned about that. So we, the audience, shouldn't be concerned about that either.
Yeah, we shouldn't. And yet I suspect there are always readers every time
Yeah,
these topics come up that are like, well, they didn't
yeah,
even address that. It's oh my gosh, like just you have to take the book on the terms that it presents itself.
yeah, yeah. And if there's a moment in the story where further explanation would have been helpful to the story and the creators didn't give us that, then it's fair criticism. You know,
Right. Yeah.
if there's a moment in time when that level of detailed explanation would have been important to the story and not just informational to the reader, and we don't get it or it's delivered poorly, then yeah, there's absolutely room for criticism there. But you know, if it's just something that you wanted because you were interested in it and the creators weren't, like that's not valid criticism in my mind, and nor I think in your mind either. Just because you wanted it, it no one cares what the story you wanted. Talk about the story you got, and if the story you got wasn't very good, then that's fine. But don't make up the story in your mind
Right.
and be
Well,
like, well, if I
yeah.
don't get
And
this,
I think that's the cardinal sin of like someone I consider to be a bad reader is someone who decides what a story has to be before they've engaged with the story and then
Mhm.
criticizes the story against their own because they're
or
making themselves like the storytelling god.
yeah, you know, when you're into a story and then you start projecting what you think or what you hope happens, and if that doesn't happen, you then get angry at the creators for not giving you that story that you had in your head, and it's like, well, like what? But yet that's a large part of fandom, the people who consume media in that way, which I think is part of the problem in a lot of ways. But
well, I mean, people can learn from my example. How many times on this podcast have I taken a big swing at the end of the series and said, like, I think this, and then we bring
yeah,
the creator on and
yeah,
talk to them, and I'm dead wrong, and I'm like, oh, that's cool. Although I think in one series, the creator was like, oh, I didn't really think of that, but no, and I
yeah.
was like, okay, well, cool. I gave him something to think about, which is like that's the cool thing about story is not about whether you're right or wrong, but like all the different things that like the final stage of they always say like the final stage of creating a movie is when the audience sees it.
Yeah.
Like because the the audience will interact differently than the actors, the director, the producers, the editor. It will hit an audience a certain way, and that's actually the final step in creating the thing. And I think the same thing is true with readers. It's like the way it hits the readers may have been a degree or two off from what was intended, but that's now what it is. That's part of the creative process.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. But that is different than the audience getting the story and being like, no, they should do something else.
Yeah, which I think is basically all that I see out of like Star Wars fandom anymore.
Yeah, that's the root of toxic fandom. The idea that I'm entitled to the story the way that I think it should be, and but and so again, if you're coming to this book being like, I want a treatise on time travel, like I want a thesis on the moral and ethical ideas and the scientific work. Now that's not what this book is.
Yeah.
This book is not that. But it does make for some really fun storytelling ideas and some storytelling tropes because it is time travel stories. So there are things you do in time travel stories that you just do, you know.
Right. Well,
And
it's like on one hand, I think trope is a fair word, but I also think it's like a little homage hat tip to like the other time travel stories that have come
yeah,
before.
again, there are things that you are expected to do. It's a matter of how I don't know, gracefully is the word that you do them and integrate them in. And I think Time Before Time is a fun book. That there's some cool things going on there that it's a nice I think it's a nice entry in the larger genre of time travel stories.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a different kind of entry. Put it that way.
Yeah. I mean, and um, I'm very pleased with the length of it too. It's one of those where it's like
It's a good
I
yeah.
think I would have grown weary at 150 issues, and I would have felt robbed at like a 12, 15 issue miniseries.
29 is good. I do wonder if again because they took a interstitial break every 6 issues. If they wouldn't have just done a 30th,
Right.
but not being beholden to arbitrary round numbers is good. You get 29 and you finish it up. But it is a good length. It's a good length, I think, for this type of story. Because I'm pretty sure I agree with you. Like telling a story like this in 2 trades, 2 arcs, it's pretty short. But a time travel story across 50, 60 issues, even that many, that's a lot. It's a lot to juggle there.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Because at some point you are now all you're doing is like retreading back over stuff that you've done, time frames and eras and storylines that you just did, in the first part of the run. So 25, 30 issues is a really good length for a story like this.
Right. I mean, if you went to like 100 issues, you would be, I think, fairly inviting people to find contradictions in your storytelling at that point.
Yeah.
It's
yeah.
like, oh my gosh, like they've probably revisited the same scene several times now. And it's one of those things where if you had it all mapped out and it's like, oh, in issue 2, they go back to 1988.
Yeah.
And if you look very faintly in the background, you can see that there's another version of them from issue 85 standing there.
And maybe a team has planned something like that out. And if so, more power to you. But like that's a lot to throw into. There's a lot of planning involved, and a lot of setup involved for yeah, I don't know. That's a long way to go with the story with a story with a premise like this.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and this is like, on some level, you remove the time travel altogether.
Mhm.
This is a guy stuck working for the mafia to pay off a debt, essentially.
Yeah.
It's one of those stories.
Yeah.
Time travel is the world it's in.
Exactly. Yeah.
And, if it was like a guy trying to get out from, a New York mafia gang,
Yeah.
I don't think you would want to read 150 issues of like his plight and his struggle. Maybe if someone just did the heck out of it, but I think there is an appropriate length for that genre.
Yes. Well, for a single narrative, the world can continue.
Sure.
The world can go on forever. And you could have done that with Time Before Time, because I think those 6 one-shots that comprised volume 6,
it's proof of concept that the
exactly.
world,
yeah.
You can camp out there, and he could even, it's his right. He could hand it to other writers and say, "Oh, you want to tell a 6-issue series?" And
they could.
They're
right.
Time Before Time world.
It's their right.
Right.
It's not one person's right. It's they could.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I thought you were saying theirs an image, and I was like, well, not without the creators, but I was one who made it singular. Anyway, I'm excited to get into it. It's going to be good.
This would be a fun one. Have we done? I mean, time travel was obviously a major part of Paper Girls,
but that's going more than 2 years back for us as a podcast.
Literally the beginning. Yeah. Have we had any other real time travel stories? Not like Underwater World has time travel elements to it. Have we had any?
I don't think so. I mean, we've done we've always done soft sci-fi when we do it. Like, Ex Machina jumps in time in terms of storytelling, but that's not time travel.
Exactly. I'm saying, like, is this our first time travel story where where it's actually
where they get in a time machine and choose?
Our characters are aware.
The first of that. Because the Paper Girls didn't understand how to control it; they just would get whisked away.
Well, but they were aware they were traveling time. So no, I think this is the fun one again. I'm looking forward to it.
All right, well, pick up trades 1 and 2, and read along, and we'll see you next week. It's available everywhere now. We've waited just long enough that it's fresh, it's new, but Hoopla has it, Public Library has it, your comic shop certainly has it, Amazon has it. Comicsology has it. Find it wherever you need to find it, and
it's readily available.
Yep. All right, we'll see you next week.